Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partner with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. And before we get into today's podcast, if you have taken time off work because of injury or illness, then you need a strong player on your team. Maurice Blackburn, Australia's #1 super claims law firm, can check if you ever have insurance as part of your super and can help you make a super TPD claim. Maurice Blackburn fights for fair. Call Maurice Blackburn on 1800 111 222 or go to mauriceblackburn.com.au. That's mauriceblackburn.com.au. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive issues and campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week's episode, we are going to speak to the former advisor in the Blair government and also in the Gillard government, a native Scot that now lives in London, but he's on the show today to help us unpack the Scottish elections that happened late last week. John McTernan joins us for today's Scottish elections review. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon and Stitcher. And if you're an Apple Podcast user, just jump on your app and leave us a rating and a review. We'd greatly appreciate that. And for all of the updates about the most recent episodes, please follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Thursday evening in really miserable, wet Melbourne afternoon, and joining on the line from South London, and I wonder if the weather's just the same, is the former director for political operations in the Blair government, and during his time in Australia, he was the director for communications for the Gillard government. John McTernan, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
It's great to be back, and yes, it is wet and grey here as well, and I think it's going to be wet and grey for most of May.
Now, let's jump straight into it. I've been itching to talk to you since last Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, watching the Scottish elections. Now, unlike Sky News in London last Friday night, we are going to talk about the Scottish elections that happened last week. I sat down to watch the coverage, and for the first 15, 20 minutes, they were only talking about the results in down south, and I had to flip over to the BBC before I could get anyone talking about the elections in Scotland. So let's jump straight in. The final wash-up of the elections, the SNP on 64 seats grew by one short of a full majority. The Conservatives stayed pat at 31. Labor lost one down to 22. The Greens grew by 2 to take themselves to 8. And the Lib Dems lost 1 by 4. Your initial thoughts on the result from the weekend?
I think it will have been a disappointment for Nicola Sturgeon not to be able to form a majority for her own party. There was a lot of confidence that the vaccine boost plus the unpopularity of Boris Johnson was going to lead to a repeat of what happened under Alex Salmond, which is a majority for the SNP. And that, I think, dangerously for the SNP, they talked up that possibility and as if that would give them the right to demand a second referendum, and they boxed themselves in. And there's a pattern normally of SNP results slightly fading off towards the election day, and that happened this time. So there was a majority in the Scottish Parliament with the Greens and the SNP to pass a bill that's a referendum bill that's ultra vires, but they'll probably do it. And I think it was good. It was good for Nicola Sturgeon. She's able to form a fourth government in a row, which she calls unprecedented. Obviously, Labour are actually forming what must be their sixth government in a row in Wales. So there's something of an incumbency factor in all of the parts of the UK, and for the Tory government, for the SNP government, and for the Welsh Labour government. But undoubtedly, it's a big result for the SNP. Labour have got a good leader, a new leader, Anas Sarwar. He's attractive. He's trying to talk about growth, building back better, jobs, not get transfixed by the constitutional debate. The SNP's main opposition, though, remain the Tories. They've got a new leader who actually managed to pick up a couple of seats for them. And there were little signs that in certain key constituencies, key electorates, the unionist vote, the anti-SNP, anti-independence vote, was willing to be disciplined and to vote for the person best placed to beat the SNP, which may have implications for the next UK general election. But essentially, Scottish politics remains in the deep freeze. There's the deep freeze of the pandemic, which means no real politics is going on. And there's the constitutional deep freeze, which is that since the decisive defeat of independence in the Scottish referendum, it's been the only issue anybody wants to talk about in Scottish politics, and that feels like it's going to go on and on and on and on. It is genuinely a never ending.
That's a wonderful overview. So let's unpack a whole bunch of things that you've just raised there, starting with the first one, which is around COVID. Scotland has basically been in lockdown since December 2020, but even before that, it's been periods of lockdown. COVID can have implications both from a campaign strategy standpoint, like in terms of the execution, but also from a campaign narrative standpoint, dominating the issue. We've looked at elections across the globe. With the exception of Donald Trump, incumbent governments have been returned, and voters don't seem to be wanting to risk change in this moment of uncertainty. How much did COVID dominate the thinking of voters when they went to the polls in Scotland?
It's interesting you raised Donald Trump there. I wonder, looking back, if Donald Trump had simply told his supporters it was sensible to wear a mask, he might have won. Yeah. Like if he had just been pragmatic and taken the experts' advice, because you can see what is happening in the US, the very fast rollout. I mean, all my American colleagues, doesn't matter what age they are, they've had two jabs, they've been vaccinated. So the outlier is quite indicative in a way. I think in all the election results in the UK, in last Thursday, the pandemic was a much bigger issue than commentators gave it, because it's a bit boring. Basically, we've had the pandemic since last March. It's a bit boring to actually still talk about it, but I think it was the dominant thing. It gave Nicola Sturgeon a daily platform. She had a daily press briefing. That means that her reasonableness was on the news every day. It was on the news channels. So I think it had a big impact. And I think what's interesting is, objectively, Britain, every nation in Britain had a really bad record in terms of turfing older people out of hospitals to open up hospital beds into care homes, a high rate of death in care homes, high rate of death compared to other European countries, high rate of death, apart from Belgium, a high rate of death compared definitely to Far Eastern countries. And it's really interesting for me that by and large in the Asia Pacific region, whether you're Australia, New Zealand, Cambodia, Korea, Taiwan, the death rates are really low, and that is almost certainly because of bird flu, SARS, the experience of having that kind of public health risk, and being prepared for that kind of public health risk happening. But I do think in a funny kind of way, this crisis has been the testing of devolution and the proving that devolution in the UK works, because Scotland got to choose its health leadership, its public health leadership, its National Health Service leadership was SNP. You had the SNP government in the devolved parliament, but it had the firepower of the Bank of England, the central bank, and it had the firepower of the Treasury with the furlough scheme, like a fire hose of cash, basically supporting people who would otherwise have been destitute. So nobody's made that case because there's no politics as normal really during the pandemic. But I think we saw our system of devolved government tested to the limit, and it came through. An independent Scotland would have had to be bailed out by the UK, having, if Scotland had left in 2014, this would be about the time when the independent institutions were working. There wouldn't have been a central bank yet. There'd still be a dollarized economy, sterlingized economy. So I think it definitely was probably the main factor. People like Nicola Sturgeon anyway. She was competent, and she herself made this an election about her handling of the pandemic. Made it the contrast between her and Boris Johnson, his handling of the pandemic, and she's never directly criticised him, but she's always made the contrast of her calmness and his less calmness, and her measured response and his. When we had tried to build some more ventilators for the health service, he called it Operation Last Gasp, and he talked about flattening the sombrero. And it's like, he can't help but use that kind of that style of his and apply it to even something as dangerous as a pandemic. So yeah, look, I think it was important. But I think and it added to. You got people who want Scotland to be independent because they want Scotland to be different and separate from Brexit Britain. You've got people who want independence because they think Scottishness is a distinct identity. And you've got people who are willing to sign up to, look, she's clearly more competent, more, quotes, social democratic than the Tory government. So good on her. So there was a mix of all those things. But she's been in government as Deputy First Minister, now First Minister, since 2007, which it's remarkable. It's sort of there's not, outside of Maragall in Barcelona, it's hard to think of a politician who's had such a long run and still has really high personal ratings and approval ratings. The system normally eats through you.
To that point, and I think about the leadership of the Labor Party in the lead up to the election in January this year, the previous Labor leader, Leonard, resigned, and the party had to sort of fast track this leadership contests, and they selected Anas Sarwar as their new leader. In a leadership contest going up against Nicola Sturgeon and the strengths that you've just articulated, then is a tough ask anyway. But then to do that with only 10 weeks to campaign for Scottish Labor and for Anas, was almost impossible. Was this election for Labor basically just to try and hold what they had and then plan for the next 5 years? Not that you could publicly say that.
Yeah, no, look, it was a holding operation. I mean, Richard Leonard selfishly hung on well after he he knew that he didn't have the confidence of the party, didn't have the confidence of the unions, didn't have the confidence of the members of Scottish Parliament. He held on so he could get himself re-elected, get himself a good position on the populist seat. And there was the operation against him. It fell one vote short when they were trying to take him out last year. And it's a classic one, which is, if you're going to do it, do the numbers, do them effectively and do it quickly. So that was a bit mishandled by the people who did it. But yeah, no, okay, this was a chance for Anas Sarwar to say, I'm here, I'm different, I'm listening. And I think the issue is not there's two people locked together, the Tory party, and Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson need each other. Nicola needs Boris to deny her a referendum she doesn't want to hold. And Boris needs Nicola to demand a referendum he can refuse. And they're locked and defined in that. And so Anas Sarwar, very cleverly, in my view, just went, this is actually not about an issue on which half of Scotland disagrees with me, independence. It's about an issue on which I think all Scots agree with me, which is we need green recovery, we need decent jobs, we need employment. And I think it's given him something to talk about, which is not about the Constitution. And I think for the times when people get bored with the constitutional wrangling, it's good to have a Labour leader who's focusing on like classic Labour issues, work, jobs, rebuilding the economy, just transition, all of those things. I think that's a good place for Labour to be. The question is how you keep your morale up when you're facing an overwhelming majority in the Scottish Parliament. And the only issue anybody wants to talk about is independence. And as soon as the pandemic is not over, but into long-term management mode, then that will be the only topic. It'll be the conflict between Holyrood and Westminster, and it's very, the independence, the constitutional issues is a new sponge just as big as the pandemic.
That's a really interesting point you make, because my next question was actually going to be to that. Like I heard Labour's Neil Finlay say on BBC Scotland's election night coverage that, and I'll quote what he said. He said, Labour wanted to talk about health, jobs and education, and the voters north and south of the border only wanted to talk about constitutional issues. He was referencing both Brexit and Scottish independence. Now, if I was working on the Scottish Labour's campaign, I would be saying, yes, let's pivot away from that and talk about the bread and butter issues that are strong topics for Labour, which is jobs, health, education. Do you agree with Neil Finlay's analysis on election night? And what does Labor have to do to get people thinking about those bread and butter issues and away from the constitutional process-driven issues about independence?
I think there's a new model of government which is really developed and patented by the SNP, but which is being picked up more widely nowadays, which is government. Yeah, like I think government is really hard. It's really hard. It's what Weber call it. It's the slow grinding of a hole through a thick board of wood. It's just relentless. It's attention to detail. It's long term. It's basically very, very hard to govern. And the SNP decided quite a while ago that they didn't want to bother with governing. They'd campaign instead. And they've made themselves into an insurgent party, and they've defined Labour as the establishment. And it's been very effective. It's very hard for Labour to shake off, even though Labour's not been in power in Scotland since 2007. Yet Labour, in some way, and the Conservatives have just picked that model up. But again, Boris Johnson finds government incredibly hard. It's full of things he's not very good at: detail, patience, hard choices, long-term views. He is in the market for airy promises backed up by skimpy funding on big issues that have some kind of connection, whether it is green jobs or whether it is levelling up, as he calls it, which is, if tackled properly, it's a very, very complex agenda to reverse centuries of economic differentiation in the UK, and it's a model of using government as a permanent campaign. And it's not just Labour in Scotland's found that difficult to respond to. I think Keir Starmer's finding it very difficult to know what to do to a government. You try and scrutinise the government, but in the end, the opposition start to sound like a government themselves. They sound like they're not interested in the big themes, the big, exciting, broad issues. And the government as permanent campaign, you see elements of that in Australia. You see the use of the bully pulpit of government and the cash of the budget to make big, bold announcements, which when you examine them, they fall apart. But that doesn't matter because you've moved off to the next big announcement, and this constant sense of finding a new frontier to make an announcement on. So the opposition is definitely finding it hard in Scotland to respond to that style of the SNP. It's got no real way. Normally bread and butter issues bring down a government. In the end, if you've got declining standards in schools, you've got poor performance in health. Scotland's got some of the worst cancer outcomes in Europe. Those kind of things become an emblematic scandal, and the government falls on it. But there's just this endless energy for spending somebody else's cash, which is what the Scottish government does. It doesn't raise most of its own revenue. It gets a fiscal transfer, which means public spending in Scotland is, I don't know, at the moment, £20 billion a year, higher than what Scotland can raise in taxes. And it makes promises based on a future flow of that money, the rivers of gold, and promises that everything that's wrong in people's lives will be fine after independence, and it's kind of like independence has become. It's a bit like Brexit. Again, there's very, very big parallels between the SNP under Nicola Sturgeon, the Tories under Boris Johnson. Independence becomes the land, like Brexit is, the land where all of your problems will be solved. You know, having trouble with your partner, well, it'll be fine after independence. And that is, and if you ever attack the reality of it, people react as though you've broken the horn off a unicorn's forehead and stabbed it to death with the horn. Like you're killing people's dreams, and it's like, well, you're being practical. You're actually saying you guys are going to have your own currency. That currency will mean mortgages 25% higher and pensions are 25% lower. And the response you get is, why are you running down Scotland? And the same is true, that technique, why are you running down Britain when you highlight a problem? You know, our welfare benefits are so low in across the UK that we have food banks. That means that the British people in the 21st century, and it is a 21st century phenomenon the last decade, people have to go to be given free food, which has been charitably donated by other people who are in work. And in a 21st century economy, that should be a scandal that cries out to heaven. But nope. Look at Brexit. Look at the bounteous opportunities of Brexit. And I think that is it's a big difficulty for progressive parties to handle that, where we sound like dads saying, no, you can't have that. You can't have that bike. You've got to save for it. We sound like the one who's trampling on people's dreams. And I think the SNP have, and now the Tories have become very, very successful at bending government to a permanent campaign. And I always used to think, I learned it from the Clinton people. You know, Clinton people came to see us in June 97, and said, the first thing you got to understand is, governing isn't campaigning. It's different, a different pace of life. And it turns out it's wrong. Governing can be campaigning, and it's quite a difficult thing to defeat, because a flexible, pragmatic incumbent can be a shapeshifter. New idea comes up, you just take it. You don't go ideologically, I can't do that. I'm a nationalist. I can't do that. I'm a conservative. You just go, oh, that looks like it's a popular idea. Let's do it.
The last time you were on the show, you spoke about, and I think at the time of Brexit, Brexit had definitely happened, but you came up with a theory that you thought that British politics in the general was realigning away from a left versus right spectrum and moving towards a leave versus remain. And you talked about how Irish politics was aligned through a pro and anti-treaty world, and that
Prism.
And you thought that going forward, this was probably how Britain was going to operate. I think it's been 2 years since you and I spoke on the show. Where is your thoughts on that theory today? And is the same thing happening now north of Hadrian's Wall in this sort of yes and no kind of world towards independence?
Look, I think I think my prediction has been borne out. I think the referendum has created new political identities, and in Scotland, the yes identity has got one party, basically the SNP, and the no identity has got three parties, which means in first past the post electoral system, you get the magnification of the United Party and the brutalization of the parties who split. 50% of people vote for one party and 50% vote for three parties, and so that's really shattering. And until you can split the other bloc, the independence bloc, then you're really in trouble fighting against it electorally. And there was some thought that maybe Alex Salmond's party, the Alba party, which he stood, might split the SNP, but what it managed to do was collect up almost all the cranks and the fringes of the SNP, put them into another party, defeat them at the ballot box, and sort of help Nicola Sturgeon by cleaning up her party a bit. In the UK, there's definitely there's a political realignment going on, and it's quite often summed up by people saying that it's no longer left right. It is cultural values, patriotism, identity, Britishness. Those are the themes on which the country separates, and the government are quite interventionist. Well, this prime minister is quite interventionist. He's willing to throw money at a problem. He's willing to build infrastructure, to effectively. This is a thing which, again, is a new development in UK politics, which is the promise is if you vote Tory, we'll spend more money on your community. 10 years of austerity will starve your locality of public spending. But if you vote for a Conservative mayor or you vote for a Conservative MP, we'll see you right. And there's the lack of outrage by the media, the lack of scrutiny of that style of politics has been quite striking for me. So there's an active attempt to bribe the voters with their own money going on. There isn't really a strategy for creating greater regional equality. There is a strategy for throwing money at Conservative seats. There is, you could crudely say that the referendum was a moment when the two parties swapped electorates. So the low-income households are more likely to vote Tory now than Labour, and high-income households are more likely to vote Labour than Tory. Now, that is a terrifying prospect for the Tories for the 2040s and onwards, because the things which make you likely to vote Labour are, do you have a degree, good higher education? So that cleavage in American politics, which is those people who've only got some education, only went to high school and left high school and went into work, they turned Republican. And if you went to a university and got a degree or postgraduate award, you would tend to vote Democrat. So the long-term trend in UK politics is towards the Labour Party. If you're urban, if you're live in a diverse community, and if you've got a higher education, if you've got a degree, if you went to university, you're likely to vote Labour. So the 2040s are going to be, all Labourers. I don't have time to wait myself. I've only got one change of clothes, so there's a problem about that, and in politics, demography is not destiny. But there is that, and it can be, you can overstate it, in my view, which is that working class people in my part of South London still vote overwhelmingly for Labour, and we're a racially diverse community. So, people of colour vote Labour. That's not to take the votes for granted. It's that people of colour understand what the Conservatives think about immigration, and they oppose that. And what's emerging in England, in big cities in England and in the south of England, London and Bristol and Cambridge and Oxford, is a fragmenting of that electorate as there is in Scotland. So people will vote Green and Liberal Democrat and Labour. And so the Tories, if you're on the Brexit leave side of the end of the market, you'll vote Tory. So you've only got one party. On the other end of the market, you've got three parties. And so the danger for Labour is that it can't reconsolidate its electorate, that it's fishing in a pool which other people are fishing in. Now, look, I tend to think that analyses that say that the Labour Party is dead and that the Tories are going to be in power forever, I've seen this movie before. In 1997, it looked like Labour were going to be perpetually in power. Back in the 70s, Harold Wilson called Labour the natural party of government. The voters, 21st century voters, are by and large wealthier than any generation before. They are by and large better educated than any generation before. And they are by and large more individualistic in their party identifications. They are loyal to the Conservative Party of Boris Johnson. They'll vote for him. In London, Boris Johnson was able to win the mayoralty for the Conservative Party. Since he left, the Tories have been unable to win the mayoralty for all money. So he didn't leave a legacy. He showed that Boris Johnson, could be elected in a Labour city. And he's now won the red wall seats and picked up seats in the Northeast, in the West Midlands, picked up traditional Labour seats, and he's got a landslide majority. He's done that for the Tory party, but perhaps he's done it for the Boris Johnson party, because it's hard to see in any other leading politician at the moment someone who could do the same thing. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, no. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, no. The Trade Secretary, International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss. You go through them and none of them have the same appeal that he has. So Labour are up against a once-in-a-generation politician who's sui generis. I think he'd like having a Latin term used of him. He's deeply attractive in a way that I think the Labour Party's not even got the measure of yet. And that's a really dangerous thing. It is, you look at a politician and you kind of think, how could we have been beaten by him? Which is like, the answer is, it's actually obvious, but you kind of get annoyed by the fact that this man beat you. You then get annoyed that voters voted for him. And the danger is you get annoyed at the voters who voted for him. So, and the minute you start telling the voters they were wrong to make the choice they made, you're in real trouble. And he's not in as many ways. He's not like Scott Morrison, but there's a suburban appeal to Boris Johnson that the Labour Party finds incredibly frustrating. And what you do in politics, what you need to do is calm down and actually accept that the other guy is attractive, that people do vote for the other guy, and you've got to work out two things. What is it that makes him attractive? And second thing is, what are his weaknesses? And don't identify a thing that you think is a weakness, because you're already voting Labour. You've got to identify a thing which the voters will think is a weakness and actually get worried by. And that, politics is hard work. And the biggest hope for the Labour Party, the biggest hope for the Labour Party in Australia and here, is the speed with which new concepts are coming into politics. In the UK in 2017, no political party mentioned net zero in its manifesto for the election. In 2019, every political party was committed to net zero, which is really interesting. It's an idea that came from outside mainstream politics, but is now definitional as an objective we all have to work for, which is good, because it then means the question is, how do you get there? And in my view, that's one of the ways in which Labour can formulate a new appeal to North and South, to working class and middle class. Any of your listeners who've ever been to Britain know that Britain has quite a supply of drafty houses. For a country that gets cold in winter, we were not very good at building houses that will be warm in winter. We're not like the Scandinavians. And so retrofitting our housing stock, which is mainly old, it's not modern housing. Most British people live in second-hand homes. Retrofitting that housing stock it would be a huge investment in blue collar jobs. There's jobs for tradies. Retrofitting the social housing stock. Now, I can see a huge appeal to offering jobs for blue collar workers, and which make middle class people feel smug about their home. I mean, it's a marriage made in heaven. So there's ways in which you can reconstruct new majorities. I think if you had, affordable houses for today's younger generation, if you had a decent pension, on an Australian model, a decent pension for today's workers, and you had a modern offer for social care for today's elders, you would actually have something that cuts across all of these artificial identities, the nationalism, the patriotism, the Brexitism, the desire for independence in Scotland. So you can fashion an appeal. The question is, and this is one of the paradoxes in my view, of the elections that we've just had, how do you get a hearing in a pandemic? And the answer is you really don't. These elections we had on May 6th were mainly meant to be held last year. Had they been held last year, there would have been, just over 6 months since just around 6 months since the previous general election, and they would have looked like what they are, which is a modest recovery for the Labour Party. Not Labour not winning votes in all the places it needs to, and not winning votes in the numbers it needs to, and Labour up against an incumbent government that is treated by the voters as a new government, because in a way it is. This is the first term of the Boris Johnson party, not the fourth term of a Conservative party government. So that difficulty, isn't it? Look, parties, after they get an incredibly difficult defeat, the public don't want to talk to them or listen to them. They want the parties to sort themselves out. A landslide defeat means the voters have said to you, what you're offering isn't good enough. Sort yourselves out. And that, I think, is one of the difficulties that Keir Starmer, leading the Labour Party, hasn't been able to show, I've got the message, I'm doing these things, because there's no bandwidth for people to listen to anything. Normally, nobody's listening to an opposition party. The pandemic is the biggest news sponge possible, so everything's about the pandemic. And people who don't want to talk about the pandemic, the last thing they want to talk about is the travails of an opposition political party. So that has been a problem. And my final thought on this complicated situation is politics has definitely speeded up. So in Scotland and in the UK, what felt like certainties have been overturned, and that by small margins, things could have been very different if the Labour Party had simply backed Theresa May's deal of staying in the single market of the European Union. That would have been passed, and there would have been no space for Boris to orchestrate a revolt against her. Brexit would have been taken off the table. There'd have been no demand for a second referendum. No Labour voters who'd voted to leave the European Union would have felt Labour betrayed them or left them or tried to have one over on them. And we'd be looking at a different situation, because Theresa May against Keir Starmer would be a very different kind of battle. So there's a lot of politics, political leadership, is improvisation. It's making the best of the circumstances you have. I think we're now going to see whether Keir Starmer has that side of him. He's got a calmness, he's got an authority, but has he got that ability to make something out of nothing, which is really the defining characteristic of a leader, to see an opportunity that nobody else can see and then to run into that space. And that's what Boris has done. Boris, 18 months ago, first time I heard about the red wall idea, I thought it was the maddest idea ever. Some Tory strategists who I knew very well, who used to work in Number 10, were talking about it over drinks, and they thought that everybody thought this is like it's a fanciful idea. But by reframing British politics, Boris has managed to deliver this. Will it hold together? I don't think you can keep making promises and not delivering on them. But I used to think that about the SNP. So it may well be that we're set for something that it's pretty solid in the UK, which is that since 1945, there's only ever been one-term government. So the public, by and large, will give you 2 terms. They'll vote for you and then give you a second shot. If Boris Johnson successfully defined himself as a new government, then Labour are looking at 2030 for the next election, which they can be competitive. And for me, in the end, Labour doesn't win that often in Britain. 45 with Attlee, 64 with Wilson in the 70s, and then 97 with Tony Blair. If you only win once every 20 years, you better have a really good agenda. Like in my view, you got to take the lesson of Gough Whitlam, haven't you? That like the Whitlam government for all the way it ended, was a whirlwind of reform and change. Troops out of Vietnam, abolish the death penalty, reduce the voting age, expanding higher education. A policy-rich agenda of reform that was absolutely right and create a new Australia. That's what you need. I mean, what Attlee did, what Wilson did in the 60s, the welfare state, the liberalisation of the country in the 60s, and what Blair did. So really, there's no excuse for Labour not spending its time thinking about how it would change this country, because there will be a moment when people realise the permanent campaign hasn't actually delivered on the reforms that there's still 2 years into government, no answer as to how social care be reformed. There's still no answer as to how the transition to net zero economy will actually be financed. So there's some big questions to be answered, and there are some big answers out there. And I think some of the most interesting thinking in the UK is not among centrists. I've not yet read an interesting book by centrist politicians about what Britain should do. There's lots of energy and excitement still on the left of politics, ideas which aren't practical, but which can be made practical. And if you look at the historic bargain made in the Democrats, which is basically the most centrist and pro-Labour unions president that the country has seen for probably since Roosevelt, has done a deal with the left to make implementable left ideas. And I think that's another part of the thing that the Labour Party has to do, a grand bargain in which the right of the party does deal with the left, which is that we make their ideas practical and they accept our leadership. And that could be quite a heady offer for the vote, because there was definitely an energy and a turmoil around Corbyn's 2017 election victory that was something new for British politics. It was a sign of the realignment on the other side. So, we have to stop fighting each other and start fighting the Tories, and we have to stop fighting for, British politics can be well described as the fight for a better yesterday. We've got to fight for a better tomorrow, an end of nostalgia, and an offer of something much bigger and better and bolder.
To that point, your former employer, Tony Blair, has written an opinion piece in the New Statesman, and I've actually attached the link to that article in the episode description. So I recommend all of our listeners, you should read it. And he makes the argument that the Labor Party in the UK require a complete deconstruction and reconstruction, or it will die. I want to just quote a quote from earlier in the piece that Blair wrote. He says, "The progressive problem is that in an era where people want change in a changing world and a fairer, better and more prosperous future, the radical progressives aren't sensible and the sensible aren't radical. The choice is therefore between those who fail to inspire hope and those who inspire as much fear as hope. So the running is made by the new radical left, with the moderates dragging along behind, uncomfortably mouthing a watered-down version of the left's policies, while occasionally trying to dig in their heels to stop further sliding towards an alienation of the centre." And I think that's the first time, from my memory anyway, that I've heard Blair be critical of both the left and the centre left, I guess, if you want to call it, of social democracy. What's your take on those thoughts that Tony's shared?
I think it's as ever an astute comment. Look, I always say to people, if a guy called Tony Blair applies to be your political strategist or your speechwriter, employ him. He's pretty good. Like, he is the best strategist I've worked for, the most scrupulous observers of the political scene. Tony, Gordon, Peter Mandelson, Julie Gillard, all able to have that detachment that gives them, are able to give an honest assessment of where things are and then try to move the blocks. And I think the start of everything is an honest assessment. and we find that very hard. And I think he's right. I think that's an acute description. I would say there is there's something of what I touched on before. I think there's more energy on the left of British politics than there is on the centre left, and that's really important because the danger of many voices in the debate inside the Labour Party is that you can be so critical of new ideas that it sounds like you think nothing should ever change, that nothing can ever be changed. You actually become a conservative, small c conservative, like going, no, I can't. That bit in government, the really dangerous moment in government is when you hear your guys on the radio effectively going, you don't understand how hard it is to be in government. You really don't understand. And that's the point that you're sacked by the voters, because the voters go, look, seriously, mate, that's the career you chose. I'm not in government. And I think you shouldn't be in government for much longer. And I think there are two dangerous strains in progressive politics. One of them is puritanical finger wagging. There seems to me to be a very easy slippage from I want people to live better lives to I want you to live your life in a better way. And one thing about Boris Johnson is he's never going to tell you how to live your life. He is not like he wouldn't dare, in a sense, because he's got his own messy life, which I think people find quite attractive. But the fact is, he will never be puritanical and finger wagging at you, which I think is a danger the left and progressives fall into. And the second thing is, which I think is almost defining, which is progressives can be miserabilists. They want to persuade the country that things are terrible. And they want to do it for two reasons. One is they want to get, in opposition, you want people to need a change. It's time for a change. Therefore, you try and run. Most people's lives aren't miserable. Most people's lives are pretty comfortable. They're pretty good, and they can do, by and large, the things they want to do with their friends and their family. And for most people, they have the resources themselves amongst their family and amongst their friends, amongst their community, to sort most of the issues that they come up against. And progressives, by and large, start from believing that government needs to solve things. And what you end up doing is you find an issue and you have to amplify it and make it seem worse and worse than it is. You amplify it until the point that you say, oh, there's a government-shaped hole here. This problem is so big, we need government. Only government can solve this. And we sort of justify ourselves. And the miserabilism is so off-putting. Right? Most people do not want to be told that the life they think is fine is horrible. They don't want to be told that they're missing some point and that things are much worse than they think they are. And that is an abiding problem that actually, the UK Labour Party fought the 2019 election on a manifesto, which talked as though every worker in Britain works for the public sector. 85% of people in Britain work for the private sector. There wasn't really any messages in the manifesto for them, apart from an old-fashioned return to trade union rights from the 1970s, which is like, I was there in the 1970s. The 70s weren't that good. 21st century is much, much better. And so I think that's what Tony's putting his finger on is exactly right. And some American Democrats, Tyler Cowen, moderate Democrats in the US, were always in favor of reaching across the aisle, getting bipartisan consensus to make changes. And the Republicans have changed in the US. They've become much more partisan and unwilling to cooperate. And one interesting thing that the Democrats are doing at the moment is, they're pushing things through and on casting vote of the of the vice president in the Senate. But what they're actually doing is they've redefined what is bipartisan, and they've basically gone, if it's popular with the public, then we'll use that as we are being bipartisan because we are being bipartisan with the American public. And I think that is an interesting way to find the radical ideas that can be practically implemented, because the country, the world is crying out for radical solutions to some really overfacing issues, but find the ones that actually can get the popular support out there. And I think that all political parties, when they get beaten badly by the voters, they first blame each other, then they blame the electorate. And you've got to stop blaming the electorate and listening to them, and you've got to start blaming each other and working together, because the one thing you do know about Labour Party members is they're all going to vote Labour. The people you need to persuade are the people who don't vote Labour. And I think there was something off-putting about, there was a period under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership when it was quite fashionable to say, I've never kissed a Tory. And it's like, well, very few people vote for ID somebody before they snog them. They're just kind of relationships are really not based on going through polling lists and vote for ID. They're based on something. And that kind of loving your own tribe and implying you hate other people takes you to a kind of, it's quite alienating for most people who don't live their life. Most people in Britain don't live their life through politics. In fact, a large number of people can't remember who they voted for in the last election. When you do opinion polling, you ask people how they voted in the last election. More people voted for the winning government, say they recall voting for the winning government, whether it's Labour or Tory, than actually did at the time. There's people out there, quite a large number of people out there, who don't remember who they voted for. It's amazing, I think, for you or me to think about that, or the listeners think about it. There are people for whom voting means so little, they genuinely can't remember who they voted for at the last election. And we can remember who we voted for every single election since we got the right to vote, and everybody we campaigned for before we could vote. So there's something about becoming more ordinary again. And I'm not fetishizing or ordinary people or ordinary life, but there is, stop talking to yourselves and start listening to other people. And the great reform of Britain under Attlee was implementing the Beveridge plan. Beveridge didn't actually come up with many new ideas. He just pulled together lots of ideas that were around and wrote them up in a very eloquent and compelling fashion. So I think there's plenty of reasons to believe that British politics will take another turn. Plenty of reasons to believe that British politics has got a need for progressive ideas, and there's plenty of reason to believe that progressive ideas can be popular. But you need to align all those things together, and it's incredibly hard work.
The one of the most depressing things, and we'll sort of probably the last couple of thoughts before we wrap up, so I know you got to go and start your day. But one of the things I found most depressing on election night on Friday evening, watching the BBC Scotland coverage, was when the constituency of Clydebank and Milngavie came up.
Yeah,
it's and for the listeners, the Australian listeners. It's on the River Clyde. Historically, it's where all the shipbuilding was. It was the heart of the Red Clyde. It's the villages of Clydebank and Duntoker and Faithfully and Hardgate. And it's actually where my family are from and where my family still is. My dad was born in Dalmuir. My cousins all still live in Duntoker and Dalmuir and the like. And it's the area where I've spent probably the majority of my time when I've gone back to Scotland, obviously. And a large Irish Catholic diaspora, that working class and middle class families there. So in my mind, it's hard to see that this was an SNP hold on election night, not even just a game. Like they've had it since 2011 or whatever, right? And I spoke to my cousins who spread across a couple of generations. The older ones, sort of the trailing off as the early, sort of later boomer generation. They're in their sort of late 50s, early 60s, had voted Labor all their lives. Last time they voted for Labor was during the Blair years, and then it's their children, these millennials, who are firmly ensconced in the middle class, are educated, and they've only ever voted SNP. But the older cousins are now voting SNP as well, and I look at that and I get concerned, because it worries me that this isn't now no longer a one-off. This is becoming habit forming for them to vote SNP. for different reasons though. The older ones are like, I don't think the Labor Party is like the Labor Party I grew up with. And for the younger ones, they're voting because they want independence, and they don't know if the Labor Party's been the party for them, and they hear the Labor Party's a union party, so they're like, nah, not voting for them.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that more for the voters out there, the listeners out there, to understand what's going on and sort of in what was once the heartland of, Scottish Labor territory and is no longer. And I'm just thinking, how does Labor win back these folks to start thinking that, Labor speaks for them? Because I think that they actually probably look at the SNP and think they are a social democratic party, that they align with their values in some way, and when actual fact that it should be us that is doing that for them.
Yeah, I think there's a paradox, which is that people want left-leaning policies, but they don't appear to want left-leaning parties to deliver them. And because the SNP aren't a social democratic party, they're a nationalist party. They want independence, and for them, independence is the end, and it's the purpose. So, equality isn't the purpose. Eradicating inequality is not the purpose. Independence is the purpose. And what they want to do is leave the UK, which is a tax and welfare union, a redistributive tax and welfare union, and join the European Union, which is a Thatcherite single market, which doesn't redistribute tax across it, because it's a single currency and a single market. It is a free movement of capital project, which begrudgingly says there can be free movement of labour too, and it's free movement of labour in the interest of capital, not free movement of labour in the interests of self-actualization. So it's very interesting that it's the most profoundly capitalist project on the globe that the SNP are pitching to join now. And the thing they want to leave is a system which gathers taxes from around the country and redistributes them to Scotland, which is an aging population, which is why it has hard demand for public services and pensions and health. It's also, Scotland is 10% of the UK population, but a third of the land mass, and if you have a third, that requires a lot more public spending to maintain public utilities and equal access to public services. And the thing which people are voting for, in one sense, the Red Wall was the precursor to the Red Wall was the Tartan Wall. The fall of those Labour seats to the SNP is a precursor of what Boris Johnson's done to the Labour Party. Now, how do you persuade people that actually what they want will be put at risk by independence is the biggest challenge the Labour Party has, and how you persuade people that what they want from Boris Johnson can't be delivered by him is the biggest challenge that Sir Keir Starmer has. And I know that something happened to the to Labour voters when they decide to vote for the SNP, and I don't really have any strategy for dealing with it apart from actually making the SNP stop talking about the referendum and start talking about actually what would your currency be? What would the transition be? How would you build a central bank? How would you actually, why would you accept the disciplines of the European Union, which set your budget deficits for you with a very tight discipline? What's the practical step? It's kind of the Tory party and the SNP are like the magic underpant gnomes in South Park. It's like their plan for getting rich is first collect underpants, second question mark, third rich, and that's like that's modern politics. Is basically the magic underpant gnomes on a massive scale, and it's really hard. it is really hard to fight hope, optimism, and dreams with reality, because it feels like, and I've said this before on this podcast, it feels like you're the one who says things can't change. It's like the problem with totalizing political visions like the SNPs and like Brexit as well is that they're that when you say, I never say Scotland couldn't be independent. I ask, why should it be independent? And when people say that the pensions will be doubled in value, the question is, well, how? In what way can you do that with less money to spend? But you sound like you're the person just going, it can't change. And so the space in politics which Anas Sarwar is trying to carve out, which is, you guys are fixated on this battle between referendum, not referendum, referendum, not referendum. And actually, the actual task is, what are we going to do about jobs and the economy? Now, I still believe that in the end, people won't vote to be poor, and people won't vote to reject everything the UK offers. But like every year it gets hard to hold to that view. I still think a referendum would lose.
John, as always, your insights analysis are, as my family would say, fucking brilliant, man. So we do appreciate you coming on the show today. And
all right,
look forward to having you back soon.
Thanks. Okay, cheers.